Hi, everyone. My name is Ali Swadek. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Campaign Finance Board. For the first time ever this June, all registered voters in New York are able to vote by mail just by requesting an absentee ballot and dropping it in a mailbox. We're in the middle of a pandemic, and most of us are spending a lot more time at home than we ever have before. So this sounds like a safe idea we can all get behind. Let's talk more about it with my guest, Tammy Patrick. Tammy is a senior advisor on elections for the Democracy Fund and a nationally recognized expert on voting by mail. Hi, Tammy. Thanks so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So, my first question is, can you give us an idea of how a majority mail-in election is different from a majority in-person election?
Yeah, so let's compare the various ways in which we can vote. And although it might seem very different whether you're voting at your kitchen table as compared to in the school gymnasium, much of it is really the same. So at the polls, you give your name and address, but by mail, you have to complete an application. At the polls, a poll worker hands you your ballot, but by mail, it's handed to you by your postal carrier. At the polls, you sign the roster or the register, and by mail, you need to make sure that you sign the affidavit, and that's usually on the envelope itself. When you go to the polls, you need to be sure that you're in line to vote by the close of the polls. And when you vote by mail, you need to make sure that you have your ballot back or postmarked by 8 p.m. on election day. Really, in both cases, it's important to follow instructions. And always, in both instances, there's assistance available if you need it. The act of voting by mail itself isn't really so different, but getting the results can be because voting by mail often requires all of the verification and processing on the back end, and that isn't allowed to begin until election day in New York. So results might be a little slower than people are used to.
That's great. What's the most important thing New York City voters should know about voting by mail?
Really, there are two main factors. The first has to do not only with voting by mail, but voting in general. And that's making sure that you check your voter registration to be certain it has all of the correct and current information, including your correct mailing address. And one of the critical elements, particularly in urban areas like New York City, is making sure that your registration includes your apartment or your unit number if that's applicable. And then also in this moment, we want to make sure that we flatten the curve, not only in the COVID area, but also in the requesting of the absentee ballot as quickly as possible, as early as you can, and then return that ballot early so that you leave nothing to chance.
That's great. So, we've been hearing a lot of misinformation about voting by mail on different forms of media. Can you just dispel some of those myths?
Yeah, it's really important to know that tens of millions of Americans vote by mail already. 5 states conduct all of their elections almost entirely by mail. And we've been voting by mail since the Civil War, which is when it all started. Military and overseas voters vote by mail in every election. Research shows that voting by mail is really a nonpartisan way to vote. Red states, blue states, purple states, they all have high numbers of voters voting that way. The way that we vote doesn't necessarily change who gets elected. What, in fact, does that, the outcome of the election, are the selections that a voter makes by opting to either vote or not, and then who, in fact, they vote for.
So it sounds like turning out to vote is the most important part. And for vote by mail, that just means putting your absentee ballot in the mailbox. Sounds easy. I've heard this one on social media. Does vote by mail cause more voter fraud?
It doesn't. So here's the thing, any way of voting has various security measures in place to make sure that anyone who does try to influence the election in more than just one vote, that it doesn't go undetected and that it gets caught. And then we just need to make sure that it gets prosecuted. So there are a variety of security measures in place, both when you vote in person as well as when you vote by mail.
That's awesome. I think it's so important for people to feel confident about voting by mail. So everything you're saying just makes it sound like it's not that different from in-person voting. Um, so, but in this time of health crisis, in your opinion, how is voting by mail safer than voting in person? So basically, why are we asking voters to do this now?
Yeah, in this moment, it's very important that we don't ask voters to make a choice between the health of themselves, their family, and their community and participating in the franchise and voting. We know that it protects both voters and poll workers by limiting the exposure to other people in the community. So far this year in 2020, we've seen voters, poll workers, and election officials be exposed to COVID because of an election. Many of them have become very ill, and unfortunately, some have died as a result. So, for those who can vote by mail, they should really consider doing that and limit the additional exposure, because it isn't just a handful of people that you are exposed to when you go to vote. It's a culmination of all of the voters over the day, that course of that day, that the poll worker has interacted with. For those, though, that do need to vote in person because they need assistance or what have you, it's important that they take advantage of early voting and or go at times that maybe aren't as popular so that they do limit their exposure, like at the beginning of early voting and throughout the early voting period. Then you won't encounter as many voters as during those busiest times, like the last few days or the last few hours in voting.
That's great. So basically, it sounds like the idea of flattening the curve that we've heard about during the COVID pandemic is kind of applicable to choosing to early vote if you can't actually absentee ballot vote.
Exactly. That's exactly right. The other piece of this is that while we're encouraging voters to vote by mail, we will have those in person alternatives. And what that also means is that we'll need to have individuals who are willing to serve their community in that way and be a poll worker. So voters can still be very active in the elections process this year in a variety of ways, being a voter, of course, and then also working the polls if they're able to.
That's great. So I feel like we have a really good understanding of what vote by mail is about now. For voters, what's the best practice for returning an absentee ballot?
So a couple of things that are important in this regard. First, and it sounds a little simplistic, but it's really honestly the best thing you can do is make sure you follow all voting instructions on the ballot, and that includes making sure you flip it over to see if there are any races or anything on the back side in case it's two sided. It's also important to pay attention to how many to vote for in each individual race. If you need language assistance or you make a mistake and need a replacement ballot, you can always call the Board of Election. Easy things like making sure that you're using blue or black ink pens. Make sure that you sign with your official signature. So, this is not the time to start out and try a new autograph style. So, you want to keep it as consistent as possible. It's important to know that the Postal Service recommends mailing back your ballot 1 week before it's due. So make sure that you get the ballot back in time is really, really critical. The important thing for this election is that all ballots are already stamped, so you don't need to provide your own. Postage is prepaid. So if you are mailing it back through the Postal Service, if you go to a blue Postal Service mailbox, you want to check and make sure the collection times so that you're not putting it in after it's already been picked up, and that might make it late. If you go and take your ballot directly to the Postal Service, you can actually ask them to postmark it for you to make sure that it gets postmarked, and you'll want to do that if it's close to the deadline to ensure that the postmark is on there. And you would just ask the person at the counter to either hand stamp it or round stamp it or hand cancel. Just ask them to postmark it for you, and they should be able to do that.
That's great. Do you have anything else to just say about this time where we're trying to vote and we're in a health crisis?
Yeah, I think it's really important. Here we are, we're in a global pandemic where people are feeling isolated, they're frustrated, they're uncertain about what's happening right now globally and in our country. But it's important that we never forget the power of the vote, of their voice and their right to be heard. So it's really important that in this moment, it just might very well be that the ballot box in 2020 is their mailbox. And we want to make sure that people participate in any channel, any way of voting that they feel they need to in order to maintain the health and safety of their family and their community.
That's great. Thank you so much, Tammy, for sharing all your knowledge with us. This is just a reminder to all registered voters in New York City. The primary election is June 23rd. Visit NYCabsentee.com to request your mail in ballot by June 16th. That's the deadline to request your absentee ballot. And you have to postmark your absentee ballot by June 22nd. Lastly, if you vote in person, early voting at your assigned poll site runs from June 13th to June 21st. So those are just some reminders. Thanks. so much.
Thank you so much for having me.